And then I'm going to hand it over to Thomas. Thomas joined the Foundations team in May and will tell us something about view components, the English view components / Rails view components, in order to avoid confusion.
Right. This is also why I've created some slides so you don't get completely confused and between Vue.js and Vue as a view component. So I hope you can see my screen, and I hope you can still see it when I jump into the presenter mode. Tell me if, yes, awesome. Okay, let's get going. Let's jump right into a quick beginner-friendly introduction. I'm sure some of you have already had the chance to get more familiar with view component, either by writing them yourself or just reviewing them. This is meant as like a intro for everyone. And I want to then bring this over into a discussion, just open discussion in how we can continue the efforts to bring also our design system in shape or in form of view components more into the server-side rendering, like using view components for pajamas, basically. But the first 10-15 minutes is going to be just a quick overview over the view component as a project itself. So as I said, first a quick why. Why is it great? Why is it awesome? Then how would you use it on a high level? And then last part, how we want to use it and how are we using it already today. But before we go into why do we want to use something new, let's quickly recap what problem we're trying to solve. And while I'm myself a big fan of like doing a lot of things traditional Rails server-side rendering, it's quite powerful and also has a bit of a comeback these days. It still has a few like unsolved problems you usually run into sooner or later on a bigger project where a lot of people work on, because it's really hard to keep this tidy, right? Like you have no a partial or a view or whatever you want to call it. I usually call it a Rails template. Has no clearly defined API. So if you feel like it, you can pass in a bunch of local variables and it works. But if you leave out one or two, maybe it still does, but maybe it was a mandatory one. And also the sort of where the logic lives is not always clear. Like when you see something that looks like a method call, could be a helper, it could be something coming from a decorator that came from a model, could have been set in the controller. So it's not as easy, and the more you build on top of these layers, the harder it gets to make sense out of it quickly, and especially hard is it to write proper unit tests for it. So this then often results in this that you write more feature tests, which are usually more costly and take more time. So this is where view component comes into play. And the basic idea, basically, is that the central point, like the view component itself, is not only a template, but it's a Ruby file. So this is already something I immediately like then, because it gives me all the niceties of Ruby, and I can reason with it. And as you already can see in this most minimal example that is more or less taken straight out of their docs, which are awesome, by the way, of view component. You can see it's just a Ruby class. It has a parent, which is the view component base class, but you could totally put like a middleman there and have like an application based component, adding some functionality in there. And you have a normal initializer, which has well, options, arguments. And since it's all Ruby, if you're trying to initialize this thing without providing a title, it will just raise and tell you, well, this is an argument error, you can't do that. So by this alone, you have like an explicit API for your component. Of course, you can provide default values and all of these things you would usually do with Ruby. Alongside this then comes a template. I mean, somewhere the template has to live, but with this pattern, the template usually is like as dumb as it gets. Like it just takes the data that was prepared by the Ruby object and renders that out. And in a simplified example, what you would do in an index view, you would just say, render me a new instance of this component with the data I provide, in this case, just the title set to my title. And you provide a content of this component. In this case, this is hello world. And you've seen this already here. I hope you can see my mouse cursor, where the content is rendered in the example component HTML. Now this results, as you probably could have guessed, in this, like just in a span, having that title and that hello world. And at that point, you might ask, okay, is that really better, right? Like, is having 2 extra files worth that? And in this example, maybe not. But nowadays, or most cases, a template doesn't look as minimal as this example did, but it more looks like something like this, where you have like you have a parent element, and you have a bunch of classes, either for responsiveness, dark mode, tailwind, whatnot. To take GitLab as an example, when you want to put a button, you have at least like 3 classes, 2 I think you've always got to apply, and some of them, or some more, depending on the category and variant, so it becomes a bit longer than the initial example was. Not even talking yet, or now talking also about accessibility concerns, like when you want to make sure that a certain role is always applied, relying on repeatedly relying on the fact that the one who does that button remembers that is more error prone than just have this handled in a component. And the more often you use that and render that out in your application, the more this pays off. Like the less repetition you have in your code, and repetition is nothing we like as developers, right? So this is the basic idea. So to summarize, what is good about it? Well, I showed you already, it has the single responsibility principle. So when you have this this class, this example component RB file, you know exactly it's only taking care of the component, and only it is taking care of the component. So this gives you like a clear interface against which you can do unit testing, because this is just a flat file. It's easy to load. And all it does is basically creating a string. So this is super fast to test. You just instantiate it and validate or expect against the output. You don't need like browser tests or anything like this. On top of the data flow is something other frameworks take a lot of focus on that too, that you have like a one-way data flow, right? That you can reason about this, where it's coming from, and that it's not just grabbing something from some helper global namespace, something like that. Performance, maybe less important, because usually HAML or HAMLit, what we use, is fast enough, but it still has to pre-compile or compile these views again and again. There is an interesting link below if you're interested in how Rails usually builds or compiles its views. It's quite intense, and with ViewComponent, it's possible to pre-compile all of them and then have these kind of sort of optimized methods that just do their thing. So like usually performance-wise, ViewComponent is faster. And all of this combined, or especially this testability and this clear interface, allows you also to just use the usual Ruby tooling you use for clean code, like mostly Robocop, and just let it work on that RB file instead of trying to make any sense or apply any linting to these inline Ruby snippets somewhere in your hammer. So these are a lot of small benefits you get from this. Before I go into a couple of features, sure some of you know them already. Any questions so far? Okay, so yeah, please.
I thought someone else would ask. I just want to clear something. So on the previous slide you had like a body for the other one. Sorry, like a body for the when you initialize a component, like where you put the hello world. Is this automatically translated into the content variable in the?
Yes. So I think in Vue.js it's called like a default slot, and this is basically it. So the child content of that block, or basically that block, is the content, and in the template file you can access this as such. And later on, we'll also see how you would use more than just this one content slot.
Cool. Okay, thank you.
I have a question relating to that. Maybe we're skipping ahead, but is there a pattern where you can use the default slots in conjunction with named slots, or do you have to use all named slots or only?
No, you can totally combine this, and I think later on we can look at an example. Also, like most of the better, or like the more expensive examples, we can actually look then in GitLab itself, because we already got one or two view components going. But you're absolutely right. You can have a mix between this content slot and one or many named slots.
Cool.
Okay, so let's look at a few features. Might also answer a few of questions you might have. One of the more like sort of boring features you would expect that it has, that is just that you can render collections. So if your Rails controller already prepared you like a list of products, usually from Active Record, you could render this this relation just by saying render me a specific component with that collection, and as long as the names match, so Rails or ViewComponent does a bit of this Rails-y convention, so the names have to match. If you have a products instance variable and you have a product component that takes in a product in its initializer, this totally works and is really useful if you want to render like a list of products on your index. A little tip, there is a couple of things I'm leaving out, of course, for the time, and but one neat thing, there is something called conditional rendering, which you can use with these lists. So the component basically can take care and say, okay, am I important enough to render? Like, if you add a render question mark method to the component file, and if that returns false for whatever reason, like date is too old or what, it wouldn't render in a collection, which can be quite a nice trick. Helpers, they won't go away magically, right? Just because we added a new gem and started using it, there's still a ton of things we're doing with helpers. I didn't take the numbers, but first time I opened the app helpers folder, I was quite overwhelmed. As Lucas said, I'm still quite new, but as like helpers are just there, and like for example, every close icon I've seen is done by a helper, or all the tiny little icons on the buttons are usually done with a helper, and we can't replace all of them on one day, right? But the nice thing about ViewComponent really is that you can start adding it or using it gradually, but already it makes it better when you start using it, because if you have to access a helper in your component code, you have to require it explicitly, or like include it explicitly, which later on would definitely help if you want to, let's say, make the icon helper into an icon component. You would, at least in the view components, you then would see, okay, this is used here and here and here. And you can still use them by just saying include that helper, and then you have access to this method, or if you prefer, you can delegate to the helpers, or both, or three options are possible. Then coming to the slots, this, I didn't add any explainer text here, sorry for that, but there's the link. So, but nice thing is the code reads quite nicely. So you can see here already this so-called block component, it wants to render, or it can render one header and many posts. So these are both on like named slots, and one is just a slot that can appear like one time, and one can be iterated on, or can be like, can put a collection in basically. In the template, you would put the contents of this named header slot into a h1 tag. And in this example, all the posts would create a section, again, with a ton of classes. Their contents, which can be whatever you put into that slot, and for good measure, an horizontal ruler. So in the index, as you would use it, you would just render that component and access the named slots by saying component dot that slot, and provide the content again as a block. And as you'd expect, it would do exactly this. So render out your H tag, and for every blog post you had in your database, I assume, like, of course, you would usually not access your database in your index file. Your controller should do that, but to keep it simple, the blog post all each would fetch the collection, and that would be passed into the multiple post slots. Yes.
Just to interrupt, Thomas, following on from Mike's question earlier, in the top right example there, if we wanted the blog component, if we wanted to pass something to, let's say it had a default slot, how would that change what that example code is doing? Would we just add a line after the render call before the with header and just have some markup there, or
right? And that can look a bit strange when you first see it. So personally, I haven't created my own like sort of linter in my head if I like that or not. Like, because on first look, it, like, you're totally right. If you wanted to have also this default slot and render it as equals content somewhere in your component template, the sort of the contents of this slot would just be like directly on the line after render, indented by 2 spaces, as you would usually do it with Hammer. And like it would be alongside those dashes saying with header. I think I'm not sure, but I think there is no special trick to avoid that. So I think there is no like with content name slot that then points to the default one. That might be like a cool pull request to do against the project. But yeah, you can mix them. You just have to be careful with the indentation.
I would follow up on that, because I'd be interested to try and play around with that more, because I remember I was playing around with it on the alert component, trying to use a default slot and a name slot, and I was having issues where it was rendering twice because it wasn't like filtering out the name slot when you use the content variable. So yeah, maybe I was just doing something wrong, but there is maybe a gotcha on that. So might be good.
I think we can later look at one example where, if I remember correctly, we do that. So maybe we can spot the difference there.
Don't need to dig into it right now, but just a note that I ran into an issue.
Okay, there's one more cool thing I want to talk about before I open this up more for a little discussion, and that is the previews you can do. And this is something we do not do yet, because when I tried to do it, and I have an open merge request for this, there's a small issue I ran with things. Let's not go into details, but there's a merge request. I'll show you that one later. But basically what you can do with those is that you create them to have like similar to the Rails mailers, where you can have this Rails mailers preview folder and you can validate that they all work and so on. You can totally do this with ViewComponent too. So you write these classes and you have multiple examples, basically. One would be like just the default title. And there you again say, render me that component. And by putting this file in the correct folder, this automatically shows you then this rendered output, this component at that URL, which is in itself a bit bare bones. But there is tooling around that, one being Lookbook, which is like a web interface for that, which is really cool. Can give you like a glimpse of that, but we don't have that yet, like that merged, but that's something I want to pursue and see if this would be helpful for developing more. But before I do that, I would say any questions go. So the basic part is done. So please, any questions you have, and then I would say we talk a bit more about what we already got in Pyjamas. Yeah, Lucas.
No, this was the clap emoji. Sorry, I was just clapping.
Oh, I thought that was the raised hand, but I'll
No.
take the clap. make sure my Gitpod doesn't go to sleep while I talk.
Let me do the tada emoji. That's better.
This I understand. Thank you.
I think I have a question, and I kind of already know the answer more or less. But yeah, first, congrats on the presentation, and I think adding a little bit of pattern on the implementation of Vue, like as a broader concept, is really cool, and we are in need of that. My question is, what do you think this would impact positively or negatively on reducing the front end code that lives in the backend, if that makes sense?
I think you first have to define both terms before I can answer this question. No, but this is an excellent question, and I think some things are still to figure out, but maybe I can show you an example component that we made for pajamas, or one or two we got, and that should hopefully give some ideas. So here you see already, like, the components, they usually live in app components. We have a subfolder already, and most of what I explained earlier you can see again. So every file has, like, appears twice. Once is a Ruby file, one has the template. And I think a neat example to look into is the card, because it's probably the simpler one. You see this one doesn't do a lot, but still is super useful, because it renders a header, body, footer, and when you then check the template, there are not too many crazy classes going on. This is quite clean, but I think by just having those and encouraging people to use them, it's usually, like, we are trying with the few we have so far to make them easy to use. So we already had, like, a few judgments calls to where when you try to make it a Vue component, then you realize, okay, this partial actually does more than I thought, and it helps also discover this complexity where you didn't think it's there, and then you find it's there. And so far we've managed to take all the cases that we wanted to migrate them over, like from the buttons, a couple of buttons and a couple of banners, and that's usually, like, not a lot of changes required. So that's what we are trying, and so I'm sorry, did that answer your question? Did I completely go away from what you've originally asked?
No, I think it answers, and it seems, and actually by showing the code, I didn't want to ask because I see another raised hand, so I'm going to ask really fast, because now this leads to how do we decide the granularity between what lives here and what lives in Vue, VUE, and yeah. So how can we decide that? And also, maybe you can compile everything on the same answer. We have a full page that has several components. So when we are writing this new page, to break it all down into components and then have the view only calling these components, how do we do this granularity of breaking down the page?
I'm not totally sure if I got the question, because you used the word view, and I'm not sure if you mean Vue.js, Vue components.
Yeah, so sorry. So in the page itself, like a page that lives in the view in the Rails view. So the controller will render a view that is on the views in Rails, and this obeys a layout that is also in the views folder in Rails. Then we have code there to write the page, and from there we either call Vue.js or we call a component that lives in app components. How do we decide if this component is going to live in the app components or in Vue.js?
Oh, you mean basically what is the decision to make it a Vue.js component or do it with Rails or with Ruby, you mean? Yeah. I think this is a group answer. So for this, I think we haven't really decided yet. So I think you can see this come from the two extremes. You can say something that is super JavaScript heavy, of course, we want to do that with Vue.js, and something that has like zero JavaScript, we definitely won't do with Vue.js. And but then finding this the two ends of this gray zone you have might be tricky. So far, the components we implemented were JavaScript free, in the sense that if they had some like on-click behavior, it's usually driven by some CSS class that gets applied to them, and some external JavaScript listens to this. This you can still totally do. But if it's, I think the decision if you want to make it in Vue.js or Rails is currently, at least with such an early stage, not different than it was without the view component gem. So yeah, that was a very political answer.
Yeah, if I might add something, I think it's similar question like when you write a single page Vue.js application, like how do you structure the components? Where do you, I think it's a similar discussion here. The biggest benefit that we can focus on right now from at least the foundations perspective, and sorry if I'm taking something away from a later thing.
Not at all. This is the discussion of starting, perfect.
Is that we basically can move things that are like everything that's a partial right now is a good candidate for a Vue component, right? And especially the ones, you know, or like parts of HTML that are repeated everywhere, like that would potentially be pajamas components. So I think there are multiple angles, right? Like one team might care about their partials because they have partials that are used 20 times. And so it makes sense for them to move them to Vue components. And obviously from our perspective, it makes sense to have a lot of basically everything that we have a GitLab UI component, or almost everything. It might make sense to have the corresponding Rails Vue component, because you don't want to write a Vue.js app just for an empty state, for example, right? Yeah. And before I talk too much, I don't know, Mark has a question and raised his hand.
Yeah, thanks, because I don't see all the raised hands, so super, Lucas, that you took care of that. Please, Mark, go ahead.
How do I lower my hand? I don't seem to be able to lower it. Oh, there you go. I have several questions, but I will sort of interleave them with other people's questions. So, you know, in case there are others. Further to Sheldon's earlier question about front end and back end, I think there have been some discussions about who reviews Rails Vue component changes. And I think there's been arguments that back end should review them and front end should review them. Does that sound right? I don't know what the latest is on this.
Me neither. So, so I think there's two things. Like one would be like adding or drastically changing the component. There, I would think you'd want to have a review from both front and back end. But just migrating existing HAML code to use a component might not be required that you like if there is no visual change, right? Maybe a backend review alone is enough. But I saw a raised hand, I think, from Git.
I just said thumbs up. Yeah, I think generally, I mean, I think definitely creating a Vue component, you should have backend and front end, because there's a lot of Ruby code and there's a lot of HTML generally. Migrating components. I guess if it's just like, yeah, if there's no visual change, although, I mean, you have to have a decent knowledge of how Ruby works for some of the components, but so I think it's kind of just like on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, so there's, I think, no strict, no defined rules around that yet. So maybe I can give you also a quick sneak peek in the components that we got already, and at the same time into this, what I've mentioned earlier, this lookbook project, which I discovered a while ago. And this is like super early, like it's just me playing around. It's not merged, not anything, but I think it's something we could add to the project as a development dependency, because it helps so much, I assume, because I haven't made much use of it yet, but it would help a lot, I think, also especially in the current phase where we want to create a lot of components, which is gonna mean a lot of reviews and so on. And for this, it's really neat. So first of all, you can have like documentation pages. If those should live in there is like maybe a different discussion. Could also say maybe some of this should live in the development handbook or alongside design GitLab com. So all of this is still open. But here you can have these dynamically created pages embedding your previews, which I've mentioned earlier, and you can have something very similar to Storybook. And is this still alive? I hope it's still alive. Oh yeah. So it's still loading, so it's kind of seems it's sleepy. But what you already can, yeah, here we go. So you can see this renders out the alert component we have already. And this is one that is fairly simple, yet it has a couple of options. So it can be dismissed or not. And when you've set that, it's just showing how it would look without it. You can provide a body, which goes in straight in here. And you can just go through all the different variants, and the way this is done, like how you enhance these preview files with info how to create these elements is quite easy or neat because it's all done with yard doc. So you just say, provide me a variant selector with these options, and so I think it would be a good idea to start writing these preview files and eventually bringing in the lookbook for us to speed up, create some demo area, and eventually this could also be moved public. So in this initial state, it will only be running in your local development machine, but in theory, or long term, it would also be a way to publish these components, maybe. So check it out if you like the idea. The merge request is open. You can also just find it by looking for the lookbook branch on GitLab. Any further questions?
Yes. Not really a question, but there does exist a plugin or something for Storybook, which makes Rails.
There is one, and this is like maybe an alternative, or maybe just like a later step. I haven't made up my mind about this just yet, but I saw that it would probably be tricky to have like these view components, like Rails components, in the same Storybook, like that renders uses the Vue.js components. I'm not sure if that is possible. And what I'd like to avoid, I think, at least in the beginning, to have like two storybooks next to each other. That might also be. So I haven't really made up my mind about this. Would be super grateful for input on that one. But like let's say the smallest step or the smaller step, I think we can take where we don't need like something that pushes to a GitLab page, or like, you know, tries to make this a public page, but just lives in your local development setup. I think would be this one. But yeah, I think it's worth exploring both, and maybe then seeing one as the continuation of the other.
Yeah, so one problem is, I don't know if you have said it, maybe I overheard it, but the thing is that you need a Rails app, and even for the Storybook plugin, you need like a running Rails server somewhere. So there's obviously questions like, how do you do review apps? And it's more infrastructure than Storybook, where we just statically render a website that, you know, GitLab pages on Nginx can serve. So yeah, but let's take it step by step. It's cool because it seems there is at least some ecosystem already, and yeah.
Awesome. Thanks for all the great questions and your participation.
Sorry, I have one last question.
Mark.
I've got several more questions, but everyone wants to go. So one last question I think is the most pressing. I don't know if this is still the case, but last time I tried to run ViewComponent tests, we seem to just use the same RSpec context. I don't know what the word is, but basically it spins up DBs and stuff just if you want to run ViewComponent tests, which is super slow. Like, how easy is it to not have that if you just want to run a ViewComponent test so that it's just running Ruby and is fast?
So I'm not too familiar with the exact setup we have. I've never checked that out yet since I've joined, but I'm pretty confident that it could be its own sort of RSpec helper that completely ignores all the database. So probably this can be made faster. Yeah. So because you're right, there's quite an overhead when you kick off RSpec. You can go grab a glass of water or something. Yeah.
I think the one consideration is already on merge request. It just runs the ViewComponents ones already, and I think Tong fixed something recently because apparently when the full suite ran, or they didn't run at all in CI, I don't know. So one consideration we need to have is like also in CI, right? Because if we would have a completely separate, like we have for front end, we have the integration tests, right? And normal just unit tests. And if we had like a split on RSpec, for example, we would need to create like new pipeline jobs and everything. But again, iteration. But I agree, it should run fast locally. Cool. Any final questions? Otherwise, thanks you all for being here, especially Doug, as you know, the one backend representative. And we will make sure.
I'm full stack.
You're full stack.
I
Shoot.
represent everything.
You represent everyone. Yeah. So is there even a backend engineer here? Peter was, right? So yeah, good. Yeah. And we will upload this so that the other people can watch it async. So hello, other people. If you see this and watched it until here, I will invite you to a drink at Nashville Contribute. Okay, cool. Let's see how many people take me up on the offer.
Might regret that.
Oh, yes. Bye.
Bye-bye.